taking its sweet time to load. Oh, and then it, of course, goes quick right at the end. Okay. It looks like we are starting to go live places, so that is good. Zoom's like telling me that we're live. Like, yes, I know, I meant to do that. So I'm going to just very quickly share a little something. You're going to see our like background tech because I need to switch over to the right thing. But yeah, so today we are doing some live cooking with Lillian, who's also a member of SASA's executive team. This is part of our Halloween bash. So we're going to be making pumpkin spiced latte today, learning about the like history of pumpkins and cooking with them and all that good stuff. It should be a real fun time. So thank you for joining us. If you're new to SASA, it stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. It is our mission to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. And part of how we do that is with live events like this. Where to find SASA? You're probably found us on some of these places if you're watching this, but we're on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch. We have a TikTok page that's a bit newer. We're also on LinkedIn. So if you want to check out any job or volunteer opportunities we have, that's a good way to see that. We also, of course, have our website, saveancientstudies.org. It's there at the bottom. So just some live event protocol. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask questions throughout the event. We'll be watching the chat. We have chat aggregators, so no matter what platform you're watching this on, we'll see all of your questions. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Hopefully this will go pretty smoothly. We've done a lot of events like this, but you never know. So our live events, as I mentioned before, are streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. The ones that are live streamed are also archived, and you can watch the recordings afterwards. So that includes this one. I actually don't think I turned on closed captions, but I will make sure to do that after I finish this PowerPoint. So yeah, our live captions are through Zoom, so they're not always the best, but better than nothing, and I will make sure to turn those on soon. And most importantly, have fun. So this is something that's not always in our live events, but our Halloween Bash is one of our 2 fundraisers that we do each year. SASA is completely run by volunteers, but we do need money to be able to host events like this, such as paying for Zoom so we can have longer than 45-minute events. We'd love to be able to pay our volunteers, and especially for people we have hosting events, we'd love to pay appearance fees. And you can become a monthly SASA supporter for as little as $3. Any amount really helps us out. You can go to saveancientstudies.org/Halloween Bash to find out other ways to support SASA, such as Amazon Smile and subscribing to our Twitch. If you become a monthly donor, though, you also get perks such as our SASA supporter brochure and quarterly updates on the progress we're making thanks to your support. And last but not least, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Lily to start talking about pumpkins.
Yeah.
Awesome. Am I good to go?
You are good to go.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Dr. Lillian Cespedes, and one of the things that I do, apart from talking about Vikings and medieval things all over the place, is actually food history. It's a huge passion of mine because I think food actually allows us to connect with everybody. We all have to eat, we have needs that need to be met. And the way we eat actually tells us a lot about how our societies have been built. And of course, being the season of the pumpkin, I thought it would be appropriate to have a celebration where the pumpkin is our star. I hear that the cool kids drink spiced pumpkin latte every single day these days. So we're giving a go at making it at home. And then I will also be telling you everything about the history of the pumpkin, why it becomes so popular, and actually how much we owe to this fruit that has actually transformed the way mankind has been operated for literally hundreds of years. But first things first, we're gonna start making our pumpkin spice latte. So we are gonna have to do a few things around the kitchen, so bear with me while I tell you the ingredients and how this works. The first thing that we need to do is put some milk to boil. We need exactly 250 milliliters of milk. Doesn't matter what milk you use. If you are lactose-free and you're using something else like oat milk, almond milk, absolutely fine. So all I'm gonna do is put this over there to boil away from the camera so that when things spill, you don't actually have to see that. And this will be the base for our latte. So I'm taking this just off for a second. Keep that on a relatively medium-low heat because we don't want that to boil over. Now, this is not originally part of the recipe, but if you like cinnamon as much as I do, you can boil your milk with cinnamon sticks. I'm actually going to put one in there just so it infuses the milk and it actually carries part of the spice into the flavor. So that's going to stay there for about 10 minutes. In the meantime, the rest of the ingredients. Of course, in order to make pumpkin spice latte, we need pumpkin, but not just any kind of pumpkin. We need specifically pumpkin puree. Now, if you live in the United States or Canada, you probably will just be able to go and buy pumpkin puree from the shop. I live in the UK and we don't have this type of commodities, so I need to make my own pumpkin puree, which you can see is in the process of being made right here. Now, if, like me, you live somewhere where these things just cannot be bought in the store, the best way to make pumpkin puree is the following. Grab the pumpkin, split it in half, and then put it to roast in the oven for about 40 minutes. When you roast it, the actual skin will come out all together, so you don't actually need to worry about peeling this before and doing that painstaking job. And the seeds, as you can see here on the back, will actually come out just by scooping them. So it will make your life a lot easier. Well, with the pumpkin as we have it, it's very soft, so we don't need to cut it. It just literally needs to be put on a recipient, and now we're just gonna blend it to make the smoothest puree that we can. Just make sure that you don't have any seeds in there. Right. For this, we require a blender. If you have one of those, nice tall food processors, then that's gonna make it smoother. If you just have a hand blender like me, just try to make it as smooth as possible. It doesn't need to be completely liquid, but as smooth as possible would be great. Now, apologies for this, it's gonna take a couple of seconds, but this is gonna make some noise. So here we go. Okay, and I think I have that pumpkin more or less pureed. I'll show you how this looks like so you can see what we're after. So that's essentially the pumpkin just mushed together. Like I said, if you have a food processor or if you have a particularly juicy pumpkin, this is gonna be a lot more liquidy than what you're seeing here, but this type of texture is absolutely fine. So it doesn't matter if it's a little bit on the thick side of things, it will work out. Right, the next thing that we need to do with this is put in 2 tablespoons, well, 2 to 3 tablespoons of this into the glass where we're gonna make the pumpkin spice latte. So I'm using a clear glass just so you can see the whole process throughout, but obviously whatever you want at home. And here we go. That's probably 1, 2, and 3. Excellent. The next stage of our pumpkin spice latte is actually adding in here the spices. Again, if you live over on the other side of the Atlantic, it's very likely you can just go and get pumpkin spice, which is just a tub that has the actual mix from where you get anything that is essentially pumpkin flavor. We don't have that in the UK, so once again, we're gonna have to make this our own way. So there's many spices that you can use for this, but the classic ones are cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. If you are quite into sort of pungent flavors, you can also crush some cloves and throw them in there, but it's entirely up to you. So let's get our spices. I'm going to start with ground ginger. And in order to make sure that I don't end up with, loads of bits of ground ginger, I'm just using a teaspoon to just go in there. And that's it. The good thing about this recipe and anything that we really put on coffee is that you can later on amend these spices if you want it to be spicier once we've added the liquids. But this will ensure that it will blend properly with the pumpkin and with the coffee. Now I'm putting nutmeg. And I'm spilling it everywhere, but never mind. Thankfully, nutmeg smells delicious, so we don't have to worry about it. And last but not least, we actually need the cinnamon, which is right here. And like I said, I'm quite fond of cinnamon, so I'm very much just gonna go here with it all. Great. We have the pumpkin puree, our 3 spices, or the 1 if you have pumpkin spice. And now we need to add to this coffee. The typical recipe would actually use espresso. If you are a huge coffee drinker like myself, you may want to actually just do it with ordinary coffee. So for this, I have actually bought Americano coffee, and we're just gonna do a very, very strong coffee. That's it. So we're gonna boil the kettle, and then we're gonna use the kettle to actually make the coffee. I know this is not the most, pure way of making tasty coffee, but at the end of the day, it's not a matter of the craftsmanship of the coffee, just the flavor. So here comes the kettle on. And meantime, I'm gonna put in this empty mug the coffee that we need. I'm gonna actually put 3 teaspoons of Americano, just because I do like the flavor of coffee. And now we just wait for it to be boiling. Now, the reason why I'm making the coffee on a separate mug is because we don't really want to pour the coffee granulates in here and then the water all together. We need to make sure that the coffee has dissolved properly in the water, so then the pumpkin puree and the spices actually carry the flavors together in the actual latte. So that's the reason why. I'm just gonna wait until the kettle boils, make sure that our milk is actually getting there. I think I might have put it a bit too low, so I'm gonna increase the heat because it's not boiling yet. And of course, remember, safety around the kitchen, so unplug all the things that you're not using. Okay. Let's wait for the kettle to boil. And let's get going. But the great thing about this recipe is that if it's even a particularly hot day and you don't want hot coffee, you can actually make it in the exact same way, store it in the fridge for about 2 to 3 hours, even put some ice cubes in there, and it will make just a perfect type of iced coffee with no problem. So it's a very versatile recipe in many ways. Okay, the kettle is now just boiling. So let's add that to the mix. Okay, so here I have the coffee, and I'm just gonna I'm not gonna fill it to the top. I'm just gonna put just enough to see the coffee dissolving. And now we're gonna go at it properly with a spoon to make sure it is smooth. So here I have my flaming cup of coffee. As you can see, when I take this out, this is completely black. There is no granules that haven't been dissolved. This is exactly what we want. Now, the original recipe for pumpkin spice latte says that for the amount of pumpkin puree we've put in there, we want about 250 milliliters of milk and about 30 to 50 of coffee, depending how strong you like it, which is what we have in here. So all we're gonna do is just transfer it for this to here. Just be careful, because obviously this is a burning, boiling liquid, and well, we don't want you to have an accident. And of course, make sure you don't spill half of it like I just did. That's easy to fix. Here we go. Now we need to give this a very good and thorough stir. As you can see, as we start stirring, all that pumpkin, all of the spices and the coffee start coming together. If you're not very fond of a latte, you can literally just have this as a sort of Americano with flavor, and it would be a little bit syrupy, but still equally delightful. Excellent. Now, as you can see, again, this is completely smooth. There is actually nothing coming out of this that isn't just liquid. That's exactly what you want. If you're not getting that texture, then you need to add just more hot water until everything is properly dissolved. I think I've probably gone a bit over keen, and I'm probably going to need a much larger glass than this, but oh well, this is part of the process. Right, I think our milk is nearly boiled. So let me finish giving this a good stir. I just don't want anything stuck in at the bottom. And let's make sure that we get all of the bits of pumpkin that have now sort of built around the edge of the glass. And there we go. So that's roughly how this should be looking like, a sort of caramelly cinnamony color, because at the end of the day, that's the color of the spices that we have in here. Let me just bring the milk, which is on the fire. Now, just like with the coffee, milk is going to be very, very hot. So I'm transferring the milk and the coffee to a bigger recipe where I can actually mix them together. So be careful when you do this at home, guys. That stays there. Here we go. With the coffee. Now, the other reason why I'm doing it this way is because in order for it to be a latte, you also want it to be more milky than coffee. So by putting the milk in first, you actually control the amount of coffee that you have. But here, we essentially have a tiny part of pumpkin spice latte. I've left the actual stick of pumpkin floating in there. Like I said, if you want to chill this in the fridge, make sure that you leave it out to cool down for about 20 minutes from the moment you've done it, so that then you don't cause any damage control to your fridge in terms of temperature changes. But that should be all the pumpkin spice latte any normal human being needs. This is actually half a liter of pumpkin spice latte, because I'm going to be having 2 different cups of coffee. And yes, this is going to be a very big coffee, but hey, this is the way we're rolling today. Now that you have your pumpkin spice, let's learn about why pumpkin becomes so popular to the point that we actually want to have pumpkin flavored coffee. For that, I'm going to share my screen. And in order to save bandwidth, I will actually turn off my camera once actually this starts working and tell you the history of pumpkin. So you should be able now to see everything on the screen. Yes, if my PowerPoint wants to work.
Okay. We're seeing it, so you should be good.
Awesome. And now I will stop the video just so things don't get a bit complicated. Okay, so here we go. This is what we're going to be looking at right now. And just as a recap, I put here the recipe for the actual pumpkin spice. So what you need is pumpkin puree, 2 to 3 tablespoons of pumpkin puree, spices to taste. Like I said, if you live in the United States, probably easy to just get pumpkin spice and just use a couple of helpings of that. Otherwise, the right combination that will give you that proper spice flavor will be cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. Then 30 to 50 milliliters of espresso or strong black coffee, depending on how strong you like your coffee, and about 250 milliliters of milk, whichever type of milk you use. If you're doing this with all of the right ingredients in one go, it shouldn't really take you more than about 5 minutes to get yourself the perfect cup of pumpkin spice latte. And of course, if you're one of those creative types, remember that, after making your coffee, add some whipped cream and some sprinkles, and then absolutely wonderful, just like if it came out of Starbucks. Well, about the pumpkin itself. Why are we so fascinated by pumpkins, and why did we start making things that tasted of them? Well, you see, the thing is that pumpkins are in many ways the actual perfect fruit, and it is a fruit. We tend to think it's a vegetable, but it's not. It's kind of like with tomatoes. And these fruits were actually important for the development of societies all around the world. Moreover, it is thanks to the pumpkin that we start seeing some very interesting interactions between the East and the West, particularly once the European colonists come over to America. So where does pumpkin originally come from? Well, the very early stages of pumpkins, which would have actually been quite different crops from what we see now. This would have been a small handball type of size pumpkins, and these originate from the entirety of the American continent. We see them actually all around South, Meso, and North America. And I would like to also clarify that when I really say pumpkin, I don't mean just the typical American round, large orange pumpkin that we think of for Halloween and things like that. There is literally no botanical difference between an ordinary pumpkin and any other type of squash. So, it is the exact same thing. So I will be using those two words, indiscriminately. Squash, pumpkin, it's all the same. Well, these pumpkins actually grew wild in the American continent, and they quickly became one of the most common crops on the earth. Some of the earliest and oldest domesticated pumpkin seeds that we've actually found in terms of archaeology come from a cave in Oaxaca in modern-day Mexico, and they actually date from about 10,000 years BC. Well, the original natives of South, Meso, and North America started collecting these fruits and using their seeds to essentially create other different types of pumpkins, which is the reason why we have so many different types of squashes in this day and age. And as they did this, they realized it was a very, very easy crop to actually, get together and farm. Essentially, in the vast majority of the rivers of North and Mesoamerica, these pumpkins would just quite happily sprout on their own, and then all the Native Americans had to go was just go and collect them the right time of the year. The other thing they also realized is that these fruits are actually very long-lasting. You can actually keep an entire pumpkin for the vast majority of the winter, and it will still be fine when you pick it up, in Easter. So if you have any leftover from Halloween, don't throw them away. You can still use them. But that's also one of the things that was very handy for the Native Americans, because they didn't always necessarily stay settled in one place. They would move, and therefore having crops that would be able to come with them and stay fine during these transitions would be actually rather handy. Now, we also know that the vast majority of Mesoamerican pre-Columbian tribes, such as the Aztecs or the Maya, used these type of pumpkins, not just as a source of nutrients, which they are great and have many, but also for many other things. From their seeds, they will create oils and sauces for cooking or for medicinal purpose. And they also will have their cups made into shells, because again, this is quite a hardy type of material. So it had many other uses. They generally helped fix so many of the problems around a household that a lot of the pre-Columbian tribes had. We also think that perhaps, but this is a contested theory, they even used the strips of skin that would have been dried under the sun as fillers for mattresses. But this is a working theory that we're still testing, and we're actually doing some works with experimental archaeology to see if this actually would make sense and if it would actually be possible. Well, that is how pumpkins start their relationship with mankind and start being part of our lives. Now, because of this, pumpkins actually become quite important items in mythology. In fact, there is many different Native American tribes that have pumpkins in correlation to their creation myths and in a lot of their festivities. For example, we know that certain tribes in the north of America, such as the Iroquois, or what we call in Europe the Iroquois, actually believe that the Mother Earth gave the natives the pumpkin as a food to sustain mankind. So it was essentially the ultimate way of keeping each other alive. Many other tribes didn't necessarily have this exact same feeling, but they would have shared similar stories linking the pumpkins in general to the idea of abundance, prosperity, and the earth. So in many ways, having a pumpkin in the household is also being able to carry around, the seed of life, essentially, or the many seeds of life in the case of pumpkin. Well, the moment in time when the Europeans come over obviously will cause some clashes and things will start changing. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the pre-colonial festivity to Thanksgiving, because essentially Thanksgiving is a tradition that the Europeans and the Pilgrim Fathers borrowed from the Native Americans, was actually a ritual that the natives did to praise their spirits, their ancestors, for the land and for the gifts that they had given them. And as such, the squash or the pumpkin was a key center of this cornucopia style of festivity, where everyone would come together and have a big feast just to say thank you for the things that they had. And that is how we make the modern transition into Thanksgiving in this day and age, which we will be celebrating shortly. Right. Now, what happens when the Europeans actually get over to the American continent? Well, we are not entirely off to a great start. You see, when the Europeans first arrived to America and they have to adapt to a different way of life, these fruits are like nothing they've ever seen. There isn't really something similar to pumpkin in European society or in any of the crops that we use traditionally in Europe. So it was difficult to adapt to this style of crop and the things that you could do with them. On top of that, the colors, the flavors, the textures of pumpkin would have been also a little bit off-putting. And to begin with, they didn't really know what to do with them. They didn't know exactly how to cook them, how to prepare them, and everything that you could get out of it. And that's the reason why the early stages of the interaction between the European Pilgrim Fathers and the Native Americans are so important. Without that knowledge, we wouldn't actually be able to succeed in organizing our crops. Question, was Thanksgiving tradition also a Iroquois festival, or do we know what tribes celebrated it in particular? It wasn't just from the Iroquois. There is actually many different Native American tribes that celebrated it, not necessarily in the exact same shape. We do have particular records of the Iroquois, but we have similar festivals from the Lakotas and also from people farther down south, mostly in the territories of Mexico and Guatemala, coinciding with the Aztec and Mayan societies as a form of leftover of their culture. But it all seems to be related to the idea that all of these people understood these were the fruits that were actually helping them thrive. And therefore, although with significant changes here and there, the pumpkins always managed to make their ways into these celebrations. At the end of the day, this was a staple food, and therefore, if you rely on something to survive, it will make its way through to the table and into, prominent places such as the pre-colonial festivity of Thanksgiving, and in general, any rituals that have to go and say thank you to the earth. There is no difference really between pumpkin and the earth. And in many ways, we could say that the pumpkin symbolizes the earth, particularly the small ones that are, pretty spheric. And that's quite a big visual symbol. And the color that a lot of pumpkins have are also, earthy colors. So there is far too many symbolisms and connections between them to not just be part of one tribe. It would be a relatively widespread idea. But the reason why the Iroquois come up quite often is because we do have a few more sources regarding them that have been translated into English or French. A lot of the sources are actually in French, and therefore we have maybe a bit more of better knowledge of those early encounters. But it's in no way, shape, or form just limited to the Iroquois at all. Well, I hope that somehow answers the question. Sorry, that was probably a bit of a long and convoluted answer, but that's the relationship between the different tribes and the pre-colonial idea of Thanksgiving. Now, coming back to the Europeans and what they actually did with the pumpkins, it wasn't just the fact that they really struggled to actually cook and find a way of eating this type of fruit. There was, of course, social political tensions and connotations that need to be kept in mind. We often talk about the relationships between the Europeans and the Native Americans being quite rocky, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is not a matter of rockiness or not rockiness. This is actually a matter of racism and colonial supremacy. We have loads of accounts, particularly up to the year 1700, that actually refers to pumpkins as the preferred food of the savages, suggesting that because they were the food of the savages, they weren't good enough for a European palate. And of course, that also meant that despite the pumpkin may have been the ultimate salvation for Europe, Europeans were very, very reticent to take up this fruit into their meals because they genuinely thought it was not good enough, simply because it came from some other people they didn't understand and that they actually thought were inferior to them. So unfortunately, as you can see, racism and our power politics even get in the way of our food and our own survival sometimes. Sad, but true. As a matter of fact, and because the pumpkins are actually such a useful fruit, this idea of the pumpkins being food of the savages and therefore not good enough will not last all that long. Particularly after the 1700s, the Europeans will really take to them, both the colonists that have arrived to America and the Europeans back at Europe for good. Yet, for a really, really long time, it will still be considered a food for poor people. Why is that? Because they were very cheap. As the crops were so abundant and they are a very low maintenance type of fruit, you could feed, a large family with just one or two of these items. It wouldn't be a great expenditure to actually fill all of those empty stomachs. And therefore, it also starts getting that classist economic reputation of this is just pauper food. But, well, eventually we start taking to them and we start seeing the value that pumpkins have and that can have for European society. There were other difficulties in terms of pumpkins and how they take to Europe that kind of make tracing our relationship to them a bit harder. And a lot of it has to do with nomenclature, with the names we give to things. And this is because Europeans just simply didn't know what this was. And they kept on trying to associate them with things they already knew. And we have this with other fruits that actually come, fruits and vegetables that come from the American continent. It's just the pumpkin was particularly challenging. Why is that? Well, as they didn't really know what this was, what to call it, etc., they tried to associate it with things they already knew. The closest thing Europeans had seen to a pumpkin before, or that were starting to be introduced to them, were things such as cucumbers and melons, which of course couldn't be further removed from a pumpkin in terms of not just the texture of the fruit itself, but the color, or at least depending what types of pumpkins and melons, and of course the way they taste. And these also give us a problem of how we actually call these pumpkins. Now, there is many different theories as to where the actual word pumpkin comes from in English, and we have two main variants, which I will proceed to explain. The first one actually comes from what we think the European rationale of the name is. As the pumpkin came and the association became that of this being essentially an oversized cucumber or melon, they tried to use words that were previously associated to these types of food, particularly anything that comes from the Latin pepo or pepum, which is actually the nomenclature that we use in botanics for pumpkins in this day and age. But pepo and pepums are the words that we see in most Latin-speaking countries to refer for cucumbers and melons. And particularly from the French, we have pepo transforming into pompions, and eventually this anglifying itself into pumpkin. Perhaps that is one of the origins of this name. The other one actually comes from the potential interaction between the colonists and the Pilgrim Fathers in North America and some of the tribes in the area of Massachusetts Bay. We think that some of the names that they used there for pumpkins were something like Popantum, and therefore from Popantum we can reach more or less the name of pumpkin eventually. But it is contested which one is the real one. And where it actually comes from. Perhaps it's an amalgamation of them both, you know, maybe the Europeans heard the natives calling it Popantum, and then with their own ideas of food, such as pompion, eventually the two combine into pumpkin. It is generally quite hard to tell. But those are the two main variants. Now, of course, as you can imagine, when you are calling a pumpkin something like a pompion, and there is already another fruit, such as a melon, also called a pompion, it becomes difficult for us when we're looking into recipe books, letters, and records of the area to really tell what pumpkin is a pumpkin and what pompion is a melon. So a lot of the time, we are literally just understanding how these pumpkins are consumed and used based on what they are served with, where do we buy them, or who brings what to the table. It's not the easiest investigation work to do, that's for sure, but well, it's allowed us to get a little bit of insight as to how these pumpkins make their way into European life. But of course, what I'm trying to say with this is that we need to take this with a pinch of salt, because unfortunately, you know, there will always be some gaps in there and some potential, you know, translations and ideas of these pompions where we will not be able to be entirely sure if they were pumpkins, cucumbers, melon, or something else altogether. So if you're ever looking into these sources and you're wondering what it is, it's not you, it's the sources and Europeans of the time actually being difficult. Well, once we actually get over this problem with the sources, we actually realized that there were lots of uses for the pumpkins, surprise, surprise. It's not like, you know, entire other civilizations have been using them as a way of sustaining themselves for centuries. And eventually we give in and we go actually pumpkin craze in Europe. The fact that they were so cheap makes things, you know, really convenient for a lot of the upcoming European societies that are starting to struggle with problems such as crops. You know, remember, this is the period that we are approaching towards the French Revolution, where crops are actually failing and we're having serious problems feeding our people. So cheap crops were good. And the fact that they were so nutritious actually meant that it wasn't just empty calories, you know, this was actually feeding people, particularly feeding peasants. So they really root themselves into our societies. And in fact, we start really experimenting with them. It's not just what we make in terms of food. We start thinking, what if we ferment pumpkin? Could we make pumpkin beer? And this, I'm just putting this out there for the, you know, cooking masters and experimental archaeologists of the world. Think about it, pumpkin beer. You know, we have things like ginger beer, so why not pumpkin beer? Maybe it would have been quite a good thing to try to make, but perhaps another time. In the meantime, in America, of course, pumpkins were still continued to be favorable throughout the 17th and 18th century because, well, they actually get used to it and they realize there is so much of it, they might as well eat them. And we see recipes for pumpkin-related produce start appearing towards the end of the 1700s. In fact, the very first recipe that we have for pumpkin pie dates exactly from 1796, and it appears in an American cookery book, a recipe by a lady called Amelia Simmons. And this is the moment in time when particularly women in different households start really taking to the idea of making these recipe books and sharing their recipes. So items like the pumpkin that are so versatile will start being the stars of this. And what becomes a pumpkin pie later on will be pumpkin soups and all of the other, plethoras of potential recipes that you can imagine. But the first one that we actually have recorded for the typical American pumpkin pie is 1796. If you look at the recipe, it's not quite exactly like our idea of pumpkin pie, but it's close enough that it is, identifiable. Let's just say that. Now, all good things eventually have to come to an end, as you can probably imagine. And pumpkins will eventually start to die out, particularly in Europe. The decline of the pumpkin goes down first in Europe and eventually in America, and you will not be surprised to know why this is. But the next slide will actually be about the struggles of the pumpkin in the 19th century. Well, why in the 19th century do pumpkins start, going down the hill a little bit? Well, consumption of the pumpkin is no longer all that relevant. And that is simply because our markets have been flooded with so many new food sources that what to begin with was a very affordable and easy to maintain crop was relevant, but it had a lot of other competition. It wasn't all that needed. And so it very much becomes a secondary type of food. This happens with a lot of items through history. So it's not surprising that the pumpkin goes through this rough patch. But it will still be a very, very loved and a staple item for the vast majority of poor families. So actually, if we were to do a social analysis of the pumpkin and completely erase, say, the middle and the upper classes from its social history, there would be no change. In fact, the harder times get in the 19th century, the more poor people ended up consuming pumpkins. But everyone else, which are the middle class and the rich, which at the end of the day are the people from where we often have the records that tell us the stories of these items, have completely disregarded them. In fact, they start thinking of them not necessarily as the food of the savages, as they once thought of, but as vulgar, as items that have no glamour and that have no, sparkle. And think that this is the moment in time when the British Empire is really expanding its food network. We're starting to see even more and more spices coming from places such as India and China. This is the moment where the curry starts becoming a very important thing in Britain. And of course, a ordinary pumpkin doesn't look as interesting as something that you can, really imbue with flavors, such as these curries and other exciting recipes that are happening in Europe in the 19th century. Essentially, European society in the 19th century is very snobbish and shallow, and it just wants new, exciting things. So a lot of foods that were popular in the previous centuries just simply take a step back. Well, despite all of this, ironically, even though they leave the table, the pumpkin will still have a prevalent image in our imaginarium, particularly from a nostalgic point of view. As much as we are not eating pumpkins as much, even in America, I would say in the 19th century, the consumption of pumpkin, goes a little bit further down than what it was in previous centuries. Despite we're not eating them, we start thinking of them as items of the good old days. And that maybe seems a bit strange for us, but as they had been such an important crop, this is a way of hailing back to our ancestors, particularly in the United States. Thinking of the pumpkin is thinking of the hardships that the Pilgrim Fathers actually had gone through. So for the 19th century society, this is very powerful nostalgia propaganda. And so pumpkins start appearing as still life paintings, random decorations elsewhere. And of course, this is how they make their way into some of our most famous celebrations of the fall, Halloween and Thanksgiving. The specific introduction of the pumpkin in Halloween, which literally has just been, and if you guys are still celebrating or haven't celebrated yet, happy Halloween. The reason why the pumpkins actually make this transition into Halloween is due to the Irish migrants that make it to the United States because of the potato famine. Now, of course, potatoes were not having the greatest time during that particular episode, and pumpkins are abundant. So the tradition of carving lanterns from Samhain, which is the original Celtic celebration and what they still celebrate in Ireland, gets transformed into the jack-o'-lanterns in Irish. By the way, and for those of you who may be interested in this, the very first kind of jack-o'-lanterns, but for Samhain, were also carved on a different type of food item, which is actually turnips. Which is the reason why they tend to look a bit more ghostly. But well, pumpkins make them have a little bit more of charm. And of course, the tradition has taken over so much that even in this day and age, we have pumpkin carving competitions. So clearly, this was not such a bad idea. And of course, the fact that the pumpkin had become such an autumnal type of food really allows it to keep on having a prime spot for Thanksgiving, not just with the pumpkin pies and soups, but with purees and similar food stuff. Well, after the 19th century, we start seeing ups and downs in pumpkin production throughout the 20th century until we start reaching the period after the war, and pumpkins start being at an all-time high once again. And these heights will actually go even farther off the roof right at the beginning of the 21st century, because this will be the moment when magnates such as Starbucks will go and think, we need new flavors for our drinks for marketing purposes. What is interesting, flavorsome, and something you can add to coffee that we haven't done yet, but that is typical American and typical autumn? And of course, the pumpkin won the marketing campaign. So after doing the early tests of how pumpkin flavored coffee would have actually tasted like in early 2003, the executive department of Starbucks decided to roll out for the first time that fall their first pumpkin spice latte, which is from where it's now being copied by every single sort of coffee shop and trademark due to its popularity. And the reason why the pumpkin spice latte took the sort of coffee market by storm is because there generally isn't anything quite like pumpkin spice out there, if you think about it. The sweetness, the combination of the flavors that makes it feel very, very autumnal. And when I mean really autumnal, I mean in general Halloweeny and Thanksgiving and a little bit Christmassy. It's a perfect combination of all of those things that puts us into holiday season. And therefore is once again that type of nostalgia that ties us and brings us to this type of drink. And humans, we are actually quite easy to sway. If something makes us feel good and has that sort of a comfort feeling, we take to it quite easily. And despite having had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the pumpkin in certain parts of the world, the pumpkin spice was a perfect flavor for latte. Well, just so you get an idea of how insanely popular this drink is, I actually have some figures for you. So since the very first campaign of pumpkin spice latte was rolled out by Starbucks in 2003 to the close of fall in 2015, they actually sold over 200 million pumpkin spice lattes, which is, it's just insane. And that's just up to 2015, of course. If we were to compare the figures with the amount of pumpkin spice lattes we've sold since then, you would still see it being one of the top charting drinks of this time period. Pumpkin spice latte has actually become so important, not just for Starbucks, but for so many other coffee shops, that it is literally their money maker before Christmas. So, if you're ever in doubt between a pumpkin spice or a gingerbread man type of drink, the pumpkin spice has the popular vote of the people. And this is what still drives a lot of the market and a lot of the marketing choices that these big and small companies do in this day and age. So what we've replicated today at home is, a prize-winning and money maker that you can just make in your house for less than £3, so $4 and a bit, and have actually a half a liter of it without having to go to Starbucks and pay the same for just a cup of coffee. And that, I believe, is very much the end of my presentation on the pumpkin spice. So let me come back into the camera so I can see you guys and potentially ask any further questions you may have. Okay, and on that note, I'm going to actually have a swig of the strong coffee because, oh yeah, that's literally Thanksgiving in just a mug. Excellent. Okay, new question. Do we know how the pumpkin got to East Asia, since it's also important in Japanese culture, for example? Yes, not just in Japanese culture, actually, but there is, China is actually one of the largest producers of pumpkins in terms of crop in the whole world currently. Like they I can't remember, but we're talking of like hundreds of tons of pumpkins are actually produced in China throughout the year, not just for Chinese consumption. A lot of it is actually to sort of trade around in the rest of Asia. But China, Korea, and Japan do have quite a big use of pumpkin. And it will be through the trade networks that get established by the East India companies, both from the Dutch, the British, and the Portuguese and Spanish empires, that those foodstuffs actually make it over to Far East Asia. In the case of Japanese culture, for example, we think it probably came via India and China, and that probably happened thanks to the Portuguese that were taking these pumpkins from the area of Brazil and some of the other colonies that they had in sort of South Mesoamerica, and then they were shipping them off over to their trade networks, particularly in Macau. But the Spanish also contributed to this, because remember, Spain actually was in charge of the Philippines all the way up to the 19th century, and the pumpkin would have been taken by Spanish culture. And of course, the British Empire and the Dutch East India Company were some of the other people that would have been moving these foodstuff items to exchange them for all other goods that they wanted from the East. So that's how they eventually make it. They make it a bit later than into European society, and we really start seeing these, not necessarily a pumpkin craze to begin with, but this interaction with pumpkins towards the late 1700s. Yes, it's about less than 100 years from the moment that Europeans really start engaging with it to the moment where Asia actually starts appreciating the pumpkin and taking it further. But there are also theories that suggest that maybe some types of pumpkins may have been exchanged with Asia way before. Obviously, our knowledge of those specific connections is a little bit reduced and often completely plagued by misconceptions of colonialism. So I wouldn't put it past it to the fact that perhaps there were some different types of variants of pumpkins that made it to Asia earlier, and maybe because of a name problem, just like we have in Europe, where we have just not been able to realize that beforehand. So this is also another possibility that we need to consider. But if nothing else, the trade routes of the Western empires are the ones really to blame for this new take by Asian cuisine in terms of pumpkins. Hopefully that makes some sense. So that's the pumpkins really making their ways around the world. But it's also interesting to see how is this convergence of people and culture that have made it change so much and have so many different meanings. And despite having been utilized by completely different cultures, we all more or less reach the same conclusion. This is a very malleable type of fruit that we can use for many, many things. So at the end of the day, this is what I was referring to at the beginning of the talk with, food is relatable to anybody. I need to eat, you need to eat, everyone needs to eat. Our senses, even though we may have personal preferences, do function the same, Things have a specific smell that triggers certain chemical reactions, so does taste, so does touch, and we are visual creatures. If you have something that looks like this, it's gonna take your attention. It's gonna make you think, what can I do with this? So it's not surprising really that an item such as the pumpkin has become, such a versatile and such an important figure of popular culture, but also of our kitchens. Any more questions that you have for me? Please make them come through. Otherwise, I think we have just a couple of minutes until the session is over. But yes, so I will probably do just a recap very quickly regarding the pumpkin spice. So you need milk for this. Any type of milk is good, about 250 milliliters. You also need 30 to 50 milliliters of espresso or really strong coffee. Then you need obviously a pumpkin to make pumpkin puree. Or if you live in the United States or Canada or somewhere else in the Atlantic side of things where you can buy this easily, just pumpkin puree on its own, about 2 to 3 tablespoons, and then the spices. If you can get your hands on some pumpkin spice, it's pretty much done, and you just need to add that to the mix. Otherwise, you need nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger. You just essentially put the puree in first, then add the spices, then add the coffee, the milk, and you're done. Pumpkin spice. And that's that from me.
Yeah, I'll just hop back on to kind of close us out and say thank you so much, Lillian. This was really fascinating. As someone that has definitely, gotten pumpkin spice drinks from Starbucks in the past, it was really neat to see how it's actually made, with the pumpkin puree. I always assumed it was just, what pumpkin spice is, but so that was very cool. And the history of the pumpkin was really neat to learn about, especially how far it's traveled. Don't really think about that or why that's happened with food. So that's always really neat to dig into. And then I also want to say thank you to everyone that joined us live, sent in questions, is talking in the chat. We really appreciate that. I know it's kind of a funky time for some people, so we really appreciate you being here. To anyone that's watching this later, thank you so much. We really appreciate your views. It's really helpful for boosting our content and all of that. We've been putting the links to the Halloween bash in the chat, so please do take a look at that. If you can't donate, we totally understand. We'd appreciate it if you share our social media posts or the link, because even that's just very helpful for us. Yeah, so thank you, Lillian. Thank you to all the viewers. Thank you to the rest of the SASA live events and executive teams that have been working on this Halloween bash. And with that, I will end the stream.